Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to talk about the 1978 film Capricorn One, which starred Elliot Gould and James Brolin and Sam Waterston, O.J. Simpson, Hal Holbrook, and Karen Black also appears in the film. It was written and directed by Peter Hyams, who would go on into the 80s and continue to work in the science fiction genre. But this was, I believe, his first science fiction film. So this film played off the premise that the moon landings were faked or staged, and that idea was already in the air in the 1970s, and of course it's continued to gain more traction through the decades that the Apollo missions were faked and everything. And this movie runs with that idea, putting it into that category of paranoid thrillers of the 1970s and movies like The Parallax View and All the President's Men, where you have this mass cover-up and conspiracy. I mean, where this is very much a post-Watergate film as well in that regard. In the story in the film is, I guess it's set in the near future, and there's going to be a mission to Mars, and it turns out this entire mission is being staged by NASA officials who are afraid if the mission would fail, the damage it would do to the economy and their contractors and all that type of thing, the loss of prestige to the government, all those things. So the movie, it sounds like a great premise for a movie, but the tones shift so much in this story, where sometimes it does have a space sci-fi feel, and sometimes we're more in an action movie. There's actually a pretty good car chase in this movie. So there's action scenes, and there's a lot of satire and comedy as well. So it's tonally, the movie is all over the place, which can be a good thing sometimes, but sometimes it can make for a bit of a jarring experience. But in the movie, it starts out where the astronauts are about ready to go on their mission to Mars. They have to leave the spacecraft. It is launched into space with nobody in it, and basically these astronauts are kept imprisoned by NASA, and they have a big set, a stage set, where the astronauts can pretend that they're in Mars and do like TV interviews and things like that, even deceiving their families and all that type of thing. So all that is kind of clever, and they actually had a really interesting mock-up of a Mars, building a set that would look like Mars. It's actually interesting, and they actually got some cooperation of NASA in this movie, or one of the contractors of NASA supplied some of their equipment. So go figure. Even though it's a very critical movie about the space program, which by the late 1970s, I mean, I guess we're kind of in that odd era where the moon mission, the Apollo missions had stopped in, I think, 72. And in the mid-70s, you had like Skylab and missions like that. And the shuttle was about to become a thing in the 1980s. So with funding cuts and all that, the space program was in a stage of transition. Mars, even in the late 60s, they were talking about going to Mars, and they had the technology to probably develop and do it probably before 1980, but clearly it just came down to budget cuts and things like that. So as they said in The Right Stuff, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. So it's always a question of money and things like that. But anyway, back to the film. So Elliot Gould, a staple of 70s cinema, plays a reporter. Common in these paranoid thrillers to have a journalist at the center of it, and he starts to get suspicious, where he had spoke to a NASA official who suggested that everything was not on the up and up, and then this NASA official ends up disappearing, and then Elliot Gould finds his life in danger. That's where I mentioned that car chase scene where his brakes in his car are basically cut off, and he ends up driving off a bridge and survives miraculously, not a scratch on him. But so at one point, Elliot Gould is arrested in his home for clearly the feds plant cocaine in his apartment. So yeah, he's just being constantly harassed by the government for his investigation. And so the astronauts, and then when the spacecraft re-enters Earth months later, it crashes, creating a cover story that the astronauts died in the re-entry, which means the actual astronauts are probably going to be killed by NASA. That's what they try to do, and then it becomes more of an action survival story where the astronauts end up crash landing in a desert in California. They have to survive, and NASA is still after them. And meanwhile, Elliot Gould is on the chase of tracking down the astronauts, and does find them with a little help from Telly Savalas, who comes in at the end of this movie, who as a old school air pilot. He flies like an old school biplane. So yeah, a wacky air chase ends this movie. So it's a hard movie to take seriously. I mean, it's definitely playing upon public skepticism about the government and many things in the late 1970s. So it's a fun movie in that regards. I feel like if it had gone into more of a more serious direction, maybe it wouldn't have worked. Or if it went into like even a more sillier direction where you go full on into comedy and spoof, maybe that would have not worked either. So it's kind of in this weird middle place of being kind of a lot of a tonally a bit of a confusing movie in that regard. But still, it's very 70s with the fashions. There's some corny dialogue throughout and things like that. And like I said, Elliot Gould is kind of carries the movie, but the astronauts themselves aren't all that interesting, with Brolin and Simpson and Waterston as the crew. There's really not much personality is given to the astronauts or anything like that. So it's a mixed bag, definitely a curio from the 1970s. And I think one last thing I think to mention about it, the conspiracy theories about Apollo have only, especially as the internet grew, those conspiracy theories continued to gain a lot of traction. And I can remember my own experience. I remember, this was a while back, I remember talking with a student, and the student just said right out, well, of course they didn't go to the moon. How do they have that technology? That was way back in the 60s. So that was kind of a moment for me where I'm thinking, well, especially as younger generations come up, there's probably going to be a lot more skepticism about what happened with Apollo. Now, me personally, I believe, yes, we went to the moon. I think there's overwhelming evidence that the Apollo missions were a real thing, and to cover, I mean, it would take like a master level of deception to cover all of that up, and it's a bit ridiculous in that regard. So I believe it, but there's even that scene in Interstellar, the Christopher Nolan movie, where students are taught that the Apollo missions were simply false propaganda for the Cold War. So I guess Nolan was kind of latching onto that idea of the missions of the 60s, kind of becoming myth, but which is unfortunate. I mean, there's a lot of cultural reasons for that. I just think we're space travel, like the space age is over, and I mean, we still, every politician still talk about missions to Mars, or private companies talk about it, but it just seems like there's never much action so far. It keeps getting moved up for whatever reason. So it's almost as if you stop the momentum of a space program in the 60s, it's almost like it's very hard to get that back, and it's complicated because of all the political ground can shift and public opinion can shift and many other reasons for it. I mean, I think if the reason for space travel is for exploration and for for advancing science, a lot of scientific advancements came out of the Apollo programs, that had nothing to do with space, really providing a lot for computer technology and many other things. So I mean, it's a debate that's not on people's minds as much anymore these days, although it occasionally comes up where some billionaire might have plans to colonize Mars or something. Not mentioning names here, but it that almost just feels like more of just an image to put out rather than anything with reality. But who knows? We'll wait and see. But anyway, Capricorn One, yeah, definitely a movie of the '70s, getting into all those themes of skepticism and malaise and the downer period following Watergate and Vietnam and all those types of things. And so this movie is a great example of that. I think where the culture was at in the late 1970s. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Capricorn One. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later.